Hey, thanks for joining our presentation on travel therapy and finances. I'm Jared Casazza.
And I'm Whitney Eakin.
We are both traveling doctors of physical therapy. We both started in 2015 after graduation as new grads. We want to share some of what we've learned over the years in regards to travel therapy, as well as in regards to finances and some of the financial considerations after school.
Yep, so we'll get started here on our presentation, and then if you have any questions after you watch our presentation, feel free to reach out to us for advice.
Yep.
So just as a general outline of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to give you some introduction, some background on who we are, and our experience with travel therapy. We're also going to tell you some information generally about travel therapy and how it works. We're going to talk about the pay, how do you get started, some recommendations that we have for those who are considering doing travel therapy as a new grad. We're also going to talk about travel therapy and how it can benefit you financially. And then in the second half of the presentation, we're going to talk about finances in general. And this part of the presentation will be helpful for anybody, not just those who want to pursue traveling therapy. And then we're also going to tie the two together and just talk about some financial considerations and how you can set yourself up for success in your future financial situation if you decide to do traveling therapy.
Yep, so hopefully you guys will get some value out of this, whether you're considering travel therapy or not. But first, just a quick disclaimer. We're going to be talking about some finance topics as well as some tax-related topics, and we want to point out that we're not tax or finance professionals. If you have any questions about your specific situation, please reach out to a finance professional and just take this as general advice and information that we've learned from our own experiences.
Okay, so to give you guys some more introduction and background on Jared and myself, as Jared mentioned, we are both doctors of physical therapy. We graduated from our respective programs in 2015. We're both from Roanoke, Virginia. I went to Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, and Jared went to Radford University, which was located in our hometown of Roanoke, Virginia. We've been travel PTs for going on 5 years now. We both started right away as new grads in 2015, and as of the time of this recording, we're coming up on our 5-year anniversary in 2020 of graduation. For part of our time as travel therapists, we lived in a fifth wheel camper. This was a little bit easier for us just moving around between contracts and living in the camper. We recently sold our fifth wheel camper and we will not be traveling in it anymore, although we will be continuing to take travel therapy contracts. We'll just do short-term housing. Right now, after our first 3 years of travel therapy, where we worked full-time, we decided to start taking off more time between contracts. And now we actually travel quite a bit, both domestically and internationally, between work. So we're getting ready to take off on a 5-month trip around Latin America. We've also visited about 30 other countries during our time since we began travel therapy. And this is all for leisure. It hasn't been for work. We don't work out of the country. We just take advantage of the opportunity that travel therapy as a career choice allows us to have this additional flexibility and time off, because we basically line up our contracts when we want to have them, and then we take additional time off of work to have fun and explore and see different parts of the world. In addition to visiting about 30 different countries internationally, we've also been to over half of the U.S. states on various road trips. We have a personal blog that's called fifthwheelpt.com. On our personal blog, we write about our own travel adventures. I write about the different places that we go for fun, all the international trips that we take. Jared also writes quite a bit about finances, student loans, all those types of things on our blog. So you can find information about that on fifthwheelpt.com. About 1.5 years ago, we also started a new website called traveltherapymentor.com, where we mentor and educate current and aspiring travel therapists on the various ins and outs. So if you're interested in learning more about travel therapy, we recommend that you visit us at traveltherapymentor.com to learn about that information.
Yep.
Throughout the presentation, you'll see a few photos. Earlier, there was one of us at the Grand Canyon where we went on a road trip in 2019, and here's a picture of us with our fifth wheel camper that we used to live in. So first, we're going to talk about traveling physical therapy specifically and give you various ins and outs about travel therapy.
Okay, so what is travel physical therapy? Basically, it's temporary employment at various locations. Usually this is about 13 weeks at a time. These jobs are all over the country, with the caveat that jobs are only available when a facility in an area needs a traveler. So you can choose where you want to work to a degree, but you can only choose where you want to work if there's jobs available in that area. So that's a question we get very commonly is, can you work anywhere you want? Yes, you can, but only if there's a job available there. Every staffing company that we know of staffs in all 50 states. It's just the number of jobs available in each state or location will vary. So why would a facility need a travel therapist? There's various reasons. Some of the big ones include maternity leave or short-term disability, where they basically have a therapist go out temporarily and they need to cover that need for a short period of time. Another common situation that we run into as travelers is a situation where they might have just had someone leave for a number of reasons, but also there are some clinics that we work in, especially in rural areas, where they may have not had a permanent staff member, a permanent therapist there for a long time, and they've just been using consistent travelers. Sometimes that can be 5 or more years that a facility is trying to hire someone permanently and they're not able to. So they basically need to fill that need with travel therapists. So those are some of the big reasons that a facility might need a traveler. Why would a therapist choose to travel? It varies from therapist to therapist, but for us starting out, it was pay. You make more money. I think most people understand that. Students or current therapists understand that travel therapists generally make more money, and that was our big reason. But in addition to that, there's other things like the adventure, being able to explore different parts of the country. For me in particular, I'd never lived very far away from home when I graduated PT school, so I wanted to get out and explore other parts of the country to see if there was somewhere that fit me better. I had no idea. Another thing that we have really started to value over the last few years is the flexibility to take time off between contracts. Like Whitney said, we have now chosen to take 1 or 2 contracts per year. We saved a lot on the front end to be able to take a lot of time off to travel internationally now. And that's really been great thing for us. One other factor that some people make the choice to travel, or that influences their decision to travel, is that they don't really know what setting they want to work in. They may have had clinicals in various settings. They may have liked some of them, not liked other ones, but they don't know specifically where they want to work. Travel therapy gives you the option to work a few months in various settings, whatever you want to work in, to kind of like test drive that setting to see if it's something you want to do long term. And that's definitely a reason that some people choose to travel.
And here's a picture of us when we took a contract up in the Boston area in New England. We were there for about 5 months, and this is when we got to go to a Red Sox game with some of our coworkers that we worked with in that area. Okay, so a little bit on how travel therapy works. So kind of the process of how do you get started and how does this whole process work. So the majority of travel therapists are going to work through a travel therapy company, otherwise known as a staffing agency. I would say 90%, 95% or more of travel therapists do it this way. So the way this works is you work with a recruiter at the company, and they help you to find jobs. They help you to line up the contracts. They'll present job options to you. They help set up the phone interview. They help with the contract negotiation, the pay, all of that stuff. The majority of us do it that way. The travel therapy company does take a commission. They take a cut of the pay for their services, and so they can make money. But in our opinion, this is a small price to pay for the hassle that it decreases. There is another option, which is to be an independent contractor. And what this means is that basically you go out and you try to negotiate your own contracts with different facilities. Now, in some cases, you can make more money doing it this way, but it is a lot more hassle. You have to negotiate your own pay, set up your own contract, the wording and all that stuff, and be responsible for your own benefits. We think it's a lot harder that way, and that's why less people do it. Mm-hmm. The last option is that of being an internal traveler. What this means is that you would work with one particular facility or like a hospital chain, and you would travel internally within all their different buildings at their different locations throughout the country. There are some pros to this. For example, you might get to have consistency with your work environment. Maybe they use the same documentation system, or it's the same type of clinic. Maybe it's all outpatient or all hospital. However, you are more limited on the areas in which you can go, and the pay is typically lower than that of a traditional travel therapist who goes anywhere and works with any facility. Now, one important step in this process of getting started, we feel, is contacting travel therapy recruiters and companies to help you get started, to help you learn the whole process, to help start your job search. Now, we always recommend that students and potential travel therapists go off recommendations from experienced travelers such as ourselves. So if you have a friend or a colleague that you know that has traveled, you can feel free to ask them for recommendations for which companies they work with. You can also feel free to ask us which companies that we recommend. Now, the reason for this is there's over 200 travel staffing agencies out there that staff for therapy disciplines, and that's a lot of companies to try to distinguish between and try to learn all the nuances and the differences. A lot of them are the same on the surface, and if you just call them up, just Google them, or find them at a conference, they're all going to tell you that they're the best. So we highly recommend that you go based off recommendations from experienced travelers so that you know that you can trust that person who's going to be your recruiter and do a good job.
And part of our website, Travel Therapy Mentor, that we mentioned earlier, part of what we've done on there is to try to interview as many of these companies and recruiters as we can to find the ones that we like. Since we have a little more knowledge than a traveler just starting out that basically is new to everything, we know more questions to ask. We can find people that we think would be reliable. So we've done that. We've spent a lot of time interviewing companies and recruiters to find ones that we like and that we can share with others.
Yeah. We always recommend that travel therapists work with or stay in communication with at least 2 to 3 different recruiters. There's lots of reasons for this. One, there's a little bit of healthy competition between the recruiters, so you know that you're going to be getting good pay offers and good benefit offers when they know that you're also working with other recruiters. It also gives you more job options because not all staffing agencies will have the same job options. So we highly recommend that you keep in touch with about 3 different recruiters. This doesn't mean that you're working with them on the same contract. You'll take one contract with one, and then if you'd like to, the next time you could take a different contract with the same one or a different one. The next step in this process of learning how to become a travel therapist would be getting licensed in each state. So every single state that you want to work in as a physical therapist, an OT, or a speech therapist, you have to have a license in each of those states to work. Now, for physical therapists, there is something called the PT Compact, which is improving this process. So normally you have to apply for an individual license in each state that you want to work in. The PT Compact is making it easier for physical therapists who are eligible for the compact to easily and quickly get licensed from one state to another and go work in a new state. Now, we recommend that you visit ptcompact.org to learn more about whether you qualify for the PT Compact. It is important to note that you must have your home state in one of the states that's participating in the compact. And here's a picture of us at the Coliseum in Rome during our trip in 2019 to Europe.
So how does travel therapy work? This is a continuation of that. When you have a few recruiters, like Whitney mentioned, that are basically, the way they work is they're almost like an agent for you, and they are looking for jobs for you. So you tell them like your search criteria. I only want to be an outpatient, or I only want to be in whatever setting, or if you're open to any setting, that's even better. You tell them what state you're licensed in. You tell them what's important for you in a job, and they basically look at all the jobs available and then present those jobs to you. And that's why it's vital to work with more than one company and more than one recruiter, because you need as many job options as possible. So during this job search, they're presenting you with jobs, and you're basically filtering those jobs out to see which ones that you want to be submitted to. When you find the jobs that you like and you tell the recruiter to submit you for those jobs, as long as the facility receives your resume and they like you as a candidate, you almost always have a phone interview after that. Now, this phone interview is a very, very important part of the travel therapy process, and it's very different than what you might expect in a regular interview or a phone interview for a permanent position. The reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, some of these facilities that you might be going to maybe have had travelers for years. Maybe they've been looking for a permanent position or a permanent person to fill a position, and they haven't been able to find anybody for a long time. In some of the situations, they might be kind of desperate to get someone in there. So the majority of the interviews that we have done, it's not really an interview where they're asking us questions about ourselves. They're mainly explaining the benefits of their clinic and what they have to offer. And then it's kind of up to us to tease out whether that job is a good fit for us. So when you go into this phone interview, it's more of you interviewing the facility and the manager than it is them interviewing you. And that is a vital thing to know. And it's important to go into that interview process prepared with some questions to ask to make sure it's a good fit for you. If the phone interview goes well and you get an idea from the manager that they want to offer you the position, then you'll get a contract from your travel therapy recruiter that will basically lay out the terms of the job. That'll be like start date, end date, pay, benefits, any days off that you need. All those things will be laid out. And then as long as all that looks okay to you, you sign the contract and move on. Generally, contracts are about 13 weeks, but they do vary. Sometimes they'll be shorter, sometimes they can be longer. It all depends on what the facility needs, what they're looking for. The next step in the process is moving to the new location. So say you sign a contract in California, you're moving out there. You have to, almost everyone chooses to drive, obviously, because you need a car when you're in that location. So even if it's across the country, it usually makes more sense to pack your things in a car and drive out there than to fly. There are situations like Hawaii where, obviously you can't drive, so you're going to pack suitcases and fly there, but most people are going to be driving. And then when you get there, or before you get there, ideally, finding housing in the location. is vital. And it's a very difficult step. Being a traveler, it's probably one of the hardest steps of taking travel therapy contracts is finding housing in each location. There are some sites that make it easier now. Websites like Furnish Finder, Airbnb, VRBO, they all make the process easier of finding short-term housing. Whether or not that's affordable depends on the situation and the area, but there are some sites you can use. As we mentioned earlier, we chose to buy an RV early in our travel career to basically not have to deal with this as much, because living in an RV and going around to new campgrounds is a lot easier than finding short-term housing. In terms of benefits, it's important to remember that you get your benefits through the travel company themselves, not through the facility that you're working at. This can be hard for some travelers to understand in the beginning, because when you go to work, you're going to this facility every day and you're working with people employed by that facility. So you would think that you would have the same benefits as them, but you don't. You have the same benefits that your recruiter would have, or like any of the people working at the travel company. You're employed by the travel company and all your benefits are through them. And along that same line, you're only employed while you're on contract. So as soon as your contract ends, that end date that's specified in the contract, you're no longer employed by that company and you're basically like a free agent now. So that's when your benefits end, and you can choose to take your next contract with them or with a different company if you choose to do so.
In this photo here, if anybody is Game of Thrones fans, we are in Dubrovnik, Croatia, which was one of the places we visited in Europe in 2019, and this is where they did a lot of the filming for Game of Thrones at the city walls. Okay, so the next concept that we want to talk about here is that of a tax home. So this can be a little bit of a confusing topic, but if you are considering getting into travel therapy, we highly encourage you to do research and do your due diligence in regards to tax homes. So the concept of a tax home is not specific to travel therapy. This is something that is regulated by the IRS. So for any employee who travels for work, this could be a pilot, this could be an electrician, someone who travels for work, the IRS basically knows that sometimes they are going to have to leave home and go stay somewhere else temporarily for work. So for example, maybe the pilot needs to stay overnight for a couple nights when he flies somewhere for work, and maybe the electrician might need to go for a couple weeks or months at a time to a new location. Similarly, a travel therapist, we go for maybe a month or 2 months, or the typical 3 months, sometimes even up to 9 months, to a new place for work. But we need to maintain a tax home in order for the government to give us these tax-free stipends for housing, which is one of the things that makes travel therapy so lucrative as a profession, because part of your pay is not taxed, because it's supposed to actually be a reimbursement for your housing. So in order to qualify via the IRS to receive these tax-free stipends, you need to make sure that you meet the requirements for maintaining a proper tax home. Here on this slide, we have a little bit of information that we got from a website called traveltax.com. We highly encourage you to visit traveltax.com to learn more information about tax homes and make sure you're doing the right thing. Some of the requirements for maintaining a proper tax home include having a primary residence where you pay expenses. So that might mean you have a mortgage there or you pay rent. For example, say you choose to keep your parents' home as your tax home. You need to have a lease with your parents, and you need to have, so say for example, you decide to use your parents' home as your tax home. If you decide to have your parents' home as your tax home, you need to have a lease there, and you also need to pay rent or have some kind of expenses there. You also need to make sure that you don't abandon your tax home. So you would want to make sure that you return often to this location. So you can't just go and work in Hawaii for a year and say, oh, I'm a travel therapist, and never come back. You have to come back home, or else you don't technically qualify. It's very important for you to know that this is your responsibility. You need to do research on this. It's not the responsibility of the facility you go work at or the recruiter. You need to make sure that you're meeting these requirements if you want to become a travel therapist and receive tax-free stipends.
Yep, very important. So travel therapy pay, this is one of the most common questions we get. How's the pay structured, and also how much do travel therapists make? So we're going to cover that in the next couple slides. Like Whitney said, it's vital to maintain a tax home in order to receive the tax-free stipends, and that really is what makes travel therapy, the pay, so much better. The pay is basically broken down into a taxed portion, which is hourly, and that's usually in the $20 to $25 an hour range, combined with per diems or stipends for meals, incidentals, and housing. And generally, that's in the $1,000 or so an hour range per week. And we'll cover an actual example of this in a little bit. But travel therapy is different than most jobs because of the fact that part of the pay is taxed and part of it is a reimbursement, meaning it's not taxed. And because of that, you can't really talk about travel therapy in terms of gross pay or salary. I mean, you can try to, but it doesn't apply as much because part of the pay is untaxed. So almost all travel therapy companies and travel therapists talk about their pay in terms of weekly take-home. And this is basically that taxable rate after taxes added to the stipends that you would receive that are untaxed. And that gives you the amount that actually goes into your bank account each week. So almost everyone will refer to pay as a weekly take-home number, which is important to understand when you're comparing travel therapy jobs. There also might be, in the pay package that you receive on the contract, some reimbursements for things like travel to and from the new location, licensing fees, background checks, PPD tests, drug tests, all of those things that you might have to pay out of pocket for. You can get reimbursed for most of that. So that also might be included on your pay package. It's important to remember that as a travel therapist, the facility that you're working at is ultimately where all the money comes from. They pay the travel company. The travel company keeps a portion of that for their fees and for their profit, their margin. And then the rest of it is broken down into either the taxable portion that we receive or the stipends that we receive. So they're kind of the intermediary that keep a portion. But like we talked about earlier, they do a lot of work for that portion that they keep. So for the most part, that is worth it. But it's important to remember that the facility pays the travel company pays us as the traveler.
And here's a photo of us in Vietnam when we did a cooking class when we were visiting Asia in 2018. That was an amazing experience. Okay, so here we're going to break down further an example to try to compare what it might be like to get travel therapy pay versus a salary pay. So an example we've given here is a typical new grad PT salary, which might be somewhere around $68,000 a year. The averages could be anywhere between $60,000 to $70,000. If it was OT or SLP, it could vary, but good average number here we're going to use for a salary. And
this really depends on your area of the country, but in our area on the East Coast, Virginia, North Carolina, we've seen a lot of new grads starting in that $68,000 range.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to use a salary number, and if you're not familiar with how salary numbers work, anybody, any type of employee typically talks about their pay in terms of their yearly salary. This is a pre-tax number. It's called gross pay, and it's a before-tax amount. So what we tried to do here was to try to break it down to compare it side by side instead of comparing apples to oranges. We're trying to compare apples to apples with travel therapy pay and a take-home weekly amount or an after-tax weekly amount. So if you take the $68,000 salary, which is a gross pay, and you divide it out by 52 weeks and subtract out typical taxes that you would pay on that amount, roughly you would be seeing about $980 a week after taxes each week. Now, in comparison, a typical travel therapy pay could be anywhere from $1,500 to $2,200 a week after taxes. Now, more typically, we're probably going to see somewhere between $1,500 to $1,800 a week after taxes for most areas of the country, unless it's really high cost of living or some positions pay higher, maybe like home health might pay a little higher. So I would say for Jared and I, the majority of the jobs that we've seen on the East Coast for physical therapists, we were making about $1,500 to $1,800 after tax a week. So as you can see, if you compare $1,500 to $1,800 a week, or let's say on average $1,650 a week, compared with $980 a week, it's a huge difference in the amount that you can make as a travel therapist compared to a permanent therapist.
Yeah, and that really depends on the travel therapy contract. It also depends on the permanent position and where it's located. But there are situations, and my situation is one of those. It's a good example of when I graduated, I was the only traveler that started out of school in my class, and there were some people in my class that took permanent jobs that were making less than half after taxes of what I was making as a travel therapist. So generally, that's not common, but it does happen, depending on how high the travel contract pays and what the permanent salary is. But in general, we say that travelers probably make somewhere between 50% and 100% more than a permanent position would probably make.
Yeah, and when we get into talking more about finances, it's important to look at the big picture here, okay? As a travel therapist, there are additional hassles that go into being a travel therapist. You do have to sometimes account for time off between jobs. You do have to account for paying for 2 homes. You need to pay expenses at your tax home as well as where you're living. So there are some things in the expense side of the equation that are going to offset your pay, but in general, if you're smart with your money and you make good financial choices, you can come out significantly ahead as a travel therapist, as you can see here with the pay comparisons.
Definitely. So here's an example travel therapy pay package. This is very similar to what we see. This is almost exactly one of our actual pay packages in North Carolina. So hourly pay is typically somewhere in the $20 to $25 an hour range, like I mentioned. For this example, $21 an hour is taxable income. And if you take that $21 an hour and multiply it by 40 hours a week, that gives you your total taxable pay for the week, which is about $840 before taxes. Then to that number, we add the stipends or the per diems that we've discussed, housing, meals, and incidentals. So that's reimbursements for those things. An important distinction here to make is that even though these are reimbursements, if you spend less than this amount, you can still keep the difference. So it's not that you have to spend all of that on these things every week. For example, in this scenario, about $1,000 a week would be stipends or per diems. Most people aren't going to spend $1,000 a week on things like housing, meals, and incidentals unless you're in an extremely expensive location. Normally, Whitney and I are spending probably less than $1,000 a month on those things. So we keep the difference between what our actual costs are and what our stipend amount is. So if you take those two amounts, the $840 and the $1,000, you end up with about $1,840 before taxes. So the important thing to remember, though, is that as a traveler, only that portion that is taxable, your hourly rate, is taxed. So if we assume about a 25% tax rate on that $840 amount, we end up with $630 added to the per diems or the stipends that we received, gives us a weekly take-home number of about $1,630 after taxes. If we put that into terms that a permanent therapist might understand and multiply that take-home amount by 52 weeks, we end up with an after-tax amount of about $84,760. If you compare that to the previous example where a lot of new grads and even experienced therapists are working at clinics making $68,000 a year before taxes compared to $84,000 after taxes, that's a massive difference. So if we take that $84,000 number and turn that into basically transition this into what a salary would have to be in order to bring home that amount of money per week, it's about the equivalent of $122,000 annual salary. So this shows that you can make a lot more as a travel therapist. It just depends on the situation, and it depends on how low you can keep your expenses as to how much of that extra money you end up keeping.
Okay, so we're going to tie this together and kind of just summarize what we've talked about in travel therapy in terms of how it relates to finances. So as we've shown in our examples here, you can definitely earn higher pay as a travel therapist. There are some additional tax benefits that could go into, for example, you're paying less in taxes because only part of your pay is taxable. It could benefit you down the line when we start to talk about some of our income-driven repayment options for student loans. It could also make a difference in your ability to have extra money to invest. Some people might choose to pay off their loans early. So when you have extra income early in your career as a travel therapist, it could allow you to have extra money to put towards your student loans. And I'm sure many of you watching have student loans that you're concerned about. So the more money you make, the more money you have to put towards paying those student loans off quickly. Some people might actually choose to go on an income-driven repayment and instead take the extra money and put it towards investments early in their career, which is something that Jared and I have chosen to do. And we're not going to go into too much detail about this, but Jared has written extensive articles about student loan repayment options, tax benefits, kind of some loopholes here and some choices to invest early in your career. But basically, the more money you have, the more options you have. Even things like home buying or family planning. Say that you want to transition later in your career to only working part-time so you can spend more time with your family, or maybe your spouse might want to only work part-time, or you want to retire early. It gives you more options if you choose travel therapy early in your career and you have more, put yourself in a better financial situation, more or less.
Definitely.
Here's a picture of us in Portugal, which is one of our favorite places that we visited while we were in Europe.
So travel therapy as a new grad, we have more and more third-year students, second-year students, first-year students, even pre-PTs contacting us, asking questions about how they would get started with travel therapy as soon as they graduate. We chose to travel as new grads. We know a lot of other people that have traveled as new grads as well that had great experiences with it. We are very happy with the decision we made. With that being said, there are a lot of new grads that start travel and they have bad experiences, and it's certainly not for everyone. So even though we've enjoyed it and we wouldn't go back and change it, we're definitely not saying that every new grad is in a position that they should travel. There are some key factors to consider if you're thinking about traveling as a new grad. One of the big things is how confident are you in your clinical abilities on your last clinical. So when you go into your last clinical, try to be as independent as possible and let your CI know that you're thinking about traveling and you know that you're probably going to have to switch clinics often, and you want to make sure that you're independent and confident in your abilities. And basically, throughout that clinical, be honest with yourself and have your CI be honest with you, and basically judge your independence level in that clinic. And that will really give you a gauge of whether or not traveling as a new grad is something that could be right for you. Another thing to consider is how quickly you adapt when you start a new clinical. Do you get used to the patients quickly? Are you able to pick up the documentation system quickly? Are you able to interact with your coworkers well and form relationships with them quickly? Because that is something that is vital as a traveler. And as a new grad, that's even more important. So think about those things about yourself and how you think that you would be able to handle switching clinics often. Another thing is moving often. It can be difficult for everyone, but particularly so for new grads because they're going into a new clinic environment, everything's new, and then to add on top of that, it's a whole new area, whole new city, and you're trying to learn everything that has to do with that, in addition to a new housing situation. So think about how well you adapt to new environments, new settings, and all those things. In terms of clinical mentorship, every travel company that we know of, I think probably almost every travel company, offers some form of clinical mentorship. And usually that means that they will give you the phone number of someone that you can call if you have questions. And that will usually be an experienced traveler like Whitney or I, that you would basically be able to call them on the phone if you have any questions about ethical issues, clinic issues, or even patient care issues. In terms of on-site mentorship, which is what most people are thinking of when they talk about mentorship, that is going to be extremely variable depending on the actual facility that you go to. Two new grads or new travelers could do everything the exact same, go to different facilities, and have completely different experiences because every facility is so unique. And a good example of this is Whitney and I. When we started traveling as new grads, my first facility was great. They gave me a long ramp-up period. I had over 2 weeks before I even started seeing a full caseload. Whereas Whitney's first site, she had a very difficult time. She went in the first day and was expected to see an entire caseload on her own with no orientation. So that is a situation that is very variable. We did exactly the same things leading up to that job. The only difference was we didn't know what to ask in the interview to make sure that Whitney didn't have that type of experience. I got lucky. So it's very variable. Depending on which clinic you go to, you might have a great person in there with you, an experienced therapist, an experienced clinical director that's able to help you, give you some mentorship that way, or you might go to a facility that has no other PT at all, and you're kind of on your own. So those are the questions you need to ask in the interview. In terms of PT versus PTA, OT, OTA, and SLPs and traveling, right now, as of recording this, the beginning of 2020, the job market is one of the most difficult it's been since we started traveling in 2015. That's especially the case for assistants. So we do not recommend right now that assistants, especially new grad assistants, start out traveling because the job options are limited and some of the jobs out there that are available are not very good jobs. So it's much better to get some experience first and then start traveling later. Whereas PTs, OTs, SLPs may be able to travel as new grads because there's more job options, but it's really something that you need to consider for yourself on an individual level.
Yeah, it's not for everybody, so we definitely encourage you to really look inside yourself and consider these factors and whether it's going to be right for you as a new grad. This is a picture of us in Paris, and also when we were in Europe in 2019. Okay, so some tidbits and recommendations on how to be successful as a new grad travel therapist. Before you start, Jared already kind of touched on this. We recommend that you learn and grow your skills in your didactic and clinical education. So you want to be a strong clinician coming out of school, regardless of what career path you choose, but really work on learning hard, learn your skills, become confident. We recommend that you gain your independence during your final clinical internship. So make sure to talk to your clinical instructors and let them know, you don't want your hand held. You really need to be able to hit the ground running when you graduate to be a travel therapist. So really try to become independent during those and confident during those last few clinical internships. We also recommend that you do research while you're still a student. If you plan to travel as a new grad, research and learn about the ins and outs of travel therapy. We've done a lot of education and putting out information on our website at traveltherapymentor.com. Almost any question that you have that you might wonder about for the process of becoming a travel therapist, you can find the information there. So we recommend you check out our articles. We also do weekly videos on our Facebook page at facebook.com/traveltherapymentor, where you can learn about the various different topics, probably questions you didn't even know you had about travel therapy. So definitely do your due diligence in regards to learning the ins and outs of being a travel therapist before you start.
And that due diligence and research prior to graduation is really what separates most of the travelers that have a good experience with the ones that have a bad experience. The travelers that we've talked to over the years that did not enjoy travel therapy or quit soon after they started are the ones that most of the time, I won't say always, but most of the time are the ones that didn't put in enough time up front, making sure they knew the right questions to ask and the right situations to avoid. If you put in the research and do your due diligence, you should have a good experience as a travel therapist.
The next thing that we recommend is definitely make sure that you find trustworthy recruiters. As we mentioned earlier, talk to us, ask us for recommendations, ask other travel therapists that you know for recommendations. You want to find recruiters that have your best interest at heart, not someone who's just going to push you into a job because they need to fill a position. Somebody who's going to really listen to you and your concerns as a new grad and make sure that you're set up in a good facility so that you will thrive and not sink or swim at your first couple jobs as a new grad therapist. During your first travel therapy placement, we recommend that you take your first couple positions in a setting in which you feel confident. Don't try out a new setting right away until you get your feet wet a little bit as a new grad travel therapist. We always recommend that you have another therapist on site at your first couple of jobs that is of your same discipline. So if you're a PT, make sure there's another PT on site and so forth, so that there's someone that you can bounce ideas off of. There are a lot of travel jobs out there where when you do your phone interview, they might say that you would be the only PT there, the only OT there, or the only PTA or so forth. We would try to encourage you, if you're going to be a new grad, take a job, make sure on the phone interview they say there's going to be another person of your same discipline there. We also recommend, again, of course, if you can have mentorship available on site. If not, or in addition to that mentorship on site, that other clinician, always have someone you can call, whether it's through the travel therapy company or resources that you have, maybe a former CI, a former professor, another PT that you know that you can contact when you have questions, because they will come up as a new clinician. You're going to have things that come up and you want to bounce ideas off of somebody else.
Definitely.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk more about personal finance. So this will apply to all of you that are watching, whether you plan to pursue travel therapy or not.
So personal finance can be very difficult. People are often intimidated by personal finance and investing because they feel like it's too complex, it's over their head. And it can be difficult, but it does not have to be. In general, personal finance can be broken down into two main formulas. Or key principles, basically. And the first one being income minus expenses equals your cash flow. So the higher you can get your income, one of the ways that is possible for therapists is being a traveler, like we've talked about, while keeping your expenses as low as possible. So the higher your income, lower your expenses, the bigger gap you have, the more cash flow you have. With that cash flow, you're going to direct that either towards increasing assets, which are things like savings accounts, houses, cars, personal property, those kind of things, or decreasing your liabilities, which are student loans, mortgages, car loans, credit card debt, those kind of things. If you're increasing your assets or decreasing your debts, effectively what you're doing there is increasing your net worth. Your net worth is your assets minus your debts or your liabilities. And if you track that number, really the most important number, in my opinion, in personal finance is your net worth number. If you track that number over time, it should gradually be going up. Obviously, the quicker it's going up over time, the better position you're going to be in the future. So those are really the two main big equations and principles. Increase your income, decrease your expenses, get the cash flow as high as you can, and then use that cash flow in a meaningful way to either increase your assets or decrease your liabilities to have the highest net worth possible. Another way to look at net worth is what you own minus what you owe. That's a good way to remember it.
And as Jared mentioned earlier, it's important to note that we are not financial advisors. We are physical therapists. Jared does have passion passionate about finances. He's done a lot of research on his own, but it's important that you do your own research. But all of what we're talking about here is these are very basic financial principles just to get yourself set up for a good personal finance situation. So here we're going to talk a little bit about some ways that you can reduce your expenses, and then on the flip side of that, increase your income.
So this is looking at that first equation on that last slide. How do you increase your income and decrease your expenses to have the most cash flow possible?
So when you get out of school, you're going to finally have this paycheck for the first time maybe ever, unless you're a non-traditional student and this is a second career choice for you. So a lot of you are going to be very excited, and you're going to want to go out and spend all this money now because you're like, wow, I've had to suffer through all these years of school and restrict myself, and now I finally have money, so I'm going to spend it. I'm going to buy a new car and get a house and buy a whole new wardrobe and go on vacation. We highly encourage you to continue to be frugal, at least for your first few years out of school, so you can manage your debt, so you can set yourself up for a good financial future. So here are some things that we're going to talk about in terms of expenses. Taxes, housing, transportation, food, and utilities are some of the biggest expenses, the major categories that we're all going to have. A lot of people don't think of taxes as an expense, but they really are. And there are ways to reduce your tax burden. Now, this is a little complicated, and if you don't know a lot about this stuff, it's okay. You can research it later, but we're just giving you a little tidbit of information. So there are some ways that you can reduce your tax burden, for example, by contributing to pre-tax accounts, such as a traditional 401k through your employer, a traditional IRA, which is an individual retirement account, or a health savings account, or HSA. Some other ways that you can manage your expenses and reduce them are with your housing situation. So if you decide to buy a house, we encourage you don't just go to the bank and say, how much can I qualify for a mortgage? Because a lot of times they'll say, wow, because you make this income, this salary, you can qualify for this big mortgage. So you can buy this $600,000 house or this $1 million house. Don't always just go off that. Buy the smallest house that you feel like you need for your life, because you don't want to have to put all your money, your whole paycheck towards your mortgage. You want to have money left over to go into savings. Some other ways that you could reduce your housing costs, maybe if you continue to live kind of like a student for a few more years until you pay off your debts, your student loan debts, continue to have roommates. If you decide to buy a house or rent a big apartment, rent out one of the rooms, do an Airbnb or something like that, so you can save on your overall housing costs. Transportation is similar. Highly recommend that you guys don't go out and buy a brand new car right after graduation and put the big bow on it and put the picture on Instagram and Facebook. There's a key figure here. New cars depreciate about 20% within the first year and between 50 and 60% within the first 5 years on average. So a lot of you guys hopefully already know this information, but it could be new to you. New cars depreciate a lot once you drive them off the lot.
Yeah, and that's huge. If you think about that number and what someone might spend on a new car, so let's say $30,000 you spend on a new car, in the first five years, it's going to lose half that value, which means that it's only now worth, if you sold it then, $15,000 or less. So if you think about that over the period of time, you're basically losing about $3,000 a year by having that car. That's a lot of money when you think about that money could be applied to student loans or investing or something else.
Yeah, so we definitely recommend you buy used. Maybe think about a smaller car, more fuel efficient, less costs overall, less taxes you have to pay on the car, those sorts of things. And also some smaller things to think about, just food costs, utility costs, any way you can reduce your expenses. We encourage you to make a budget and stick to it so that you know where your money's going each month, and try not to spend too much on frivolous things. I mean, even just small things like buying Starbucks coffee every day or eating lunch out every day. These little things can add up. So we highly encourage you just reduce your expenses as much as possible so you can put more money towards paying off your debts early in your career and more money towards savings.
Yeah, and eating, drinking out, things like that, that might not seem like that much, but we definitely know people that don't track their expenses, they don't pay much attention to this, and they might spend as much eating and drinking out as they do on like their mortgage payment or their rent payment. Like, it can add up very quickly, especially if you're going to expensive places and spending a lot of money each time. So definitely something to think about.
Yeah, and here's a picture of us in Thailand playing with elephants in 2018. And again, all these photos from out of the country, we weren't working out of the country, but these are all just trips for fun. Here's another photo actually when we were working in North Carolina. It's a picture of us hiking right off the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina just on the weekend during one of our travel therapy assignments. So the flip side of this equation, talking about reducing your expenses, the other side of this is maximizing your income as much as possible. So one way that we talked about that you can maximize your income is by pursuing a career in travel therapy. If you decide travel therapy is not right for you, there's other options. So you could pursue the highest paying position possible. For example, in a setting like home health that tends to pay a little higher. If you decide to open your own cash-based practice, particularly for physical therapists, that might lead to further income in the future after your initial startup costs. In addition, thinking about things like working in more of a rural area. So sometimes you're not always going to earn the highest paycheck in the really desirable areas like, I don't know, San Diego or Austin, Texas, or Raleigh, North Carolina. Like these really highly desirable areas, big cities may have a lot of competition for jobs, which drives the salaries down.
Recently, we were in Denver for CSM, and we talked to some of Whitney's classmates that moved there after graduation, and they were talking about how the salary there is lower than where she went to school in Virginia Beach, but the cost of living is way higher. Mm-hmm. So just because the cost of living is high doesn't mean salaries are high. If there's a lot of competition, usually salaries are lower. So in the big cities, yeah, sometimes cost of living will be really high and your pay won't be that much, which means saving is difficult.
Yeah, so we highly encourage you to try to get a higher paying position if possible, even if that means you need to work somewhere a little on the outskirts of town or a little more rural if optimizing your finances is one of your goals. Some other ways that you could increase your income potential would be working PRN in addition to having a permanent job. For example, we know some people that will pick up home health visits PRN on the side outside of their permanent position, just some ways to make some extra cash, pay off those debts, increase your savings. You might even think about working overtime if it's available, if you're an hourly employee at your primary position. You might think about getting advanced certification and gaining additional skills. This doesn't always directly correlate and lead to having higher salary. For example, if you have like an OCS or GCS if you're a physical therapist, but it could increase your negotiating power when you're applying for a raise or a new position. Also, if you're thinking about just doing something outside of the therapy realm as a side hustle or side business, maybe you're burnt out on your 9-to-5 job and you just want to pick up some work on the side in another area that you might be passionate about, for example, crafting or driving for Uber or being a caregiver. There's just some other options just to get a little extra cash on the side.
This is a financial comparison between a permanent therapist and a travel therapist, looking at, when you factor all these things in, how that equation of increasing income, decreasing expenses, how that might look between a permanent and a travel therapist. So gross income, we talked about in the range, in our area at least, the range is usually between $65,000 and $70,000. We have seen some new grads taking jobs for even less than that in more desirable areas, bigger cities in North Carolina and Virginia. So it really depends, but we're going to use the $67,000 number, which seems to be fairly average, compared to a traveler who, on the previous slides, we showed the a pay package there and how that would apply over the length of an entire year in terms of gross pay. And so in this situation, we're basing it on working 48 weeks per year, making $1,700 a week after taxes, which is a fairly normal pay range that we've seen from our contracts. So the permanent position makes less, obviously. In addition, they have to pay more in taxes because their full pay is taxed versus the travel therapist, only part of their pay is taxed. So the permanent person may pay $17,000 in taxes, whereas the travel therapist probably pays about $8,000, even on that salary that seems huge because of the reimbursements they receive that are tax-free. All the expenses here, so this is more of an average, I would say. If you add up all the expenses for maybe a permanent therapist, probably about $40,000 a year. That could be higher or lower depending on your living situation, your family situation, all that. As a traveler, the expenses are going to be slightly higher, like we mentioned. So things like maintaining duplicate housing, having a tax home that you return to, going to and from assignment locations, all that, taking weeks off of work that maybe you couldn't find an assignment or something like that. All this will add to your expenses, and in general, we say about 25% more probably compared to a permanent therapist in expenses. So if you take those numbers, subtract it all out, you're left a permanent position, a cash flow number of maybe about $10,000 per year, whereas a traveler might have a cash flow of about $31,600 in this example. And like we said, these are pretty realistic numbers from what we've seen, travelers we've talked to, as well as permanent therapists we've talked to.
So keep these numbers in mind. In a couple slides here, we're going to talk about how you could use this extra cash flow, or for basically, in all intents and purposes, this is extra money you can put towards either paying down debts or investing and putting towards savings in the future. So we're going to talk about how you could use this extra cash, whether it's the $10,000 if you choose a permanent position or the $31,000 if you choose a travel position. And this is a picture of us when we were on a road trip out west. We went through Colorado Springs, and this is a hike called the Incline where we almost died. It was fun, though, in its own way. So I highly recommend you visit that area in Colorado Springs. Okay, so we're going to talk about student loan management a little bit, just kind of an overview here, and then we're going to go into some financial examples about repaying student loans. So I'm sure that many of you watching this have student loans. Jared and I do as well. We want to talk about the concept of what a student loan servicer is. So for a lot of you guys, you probably haven't thought much about this because you're still in school, maybe, and you just haven't thought about, well, what's going to happen when I get out of school? What happens? So you have to repay those loans, unfortunately. A lot of you, if you took out government loans, they would be taken out through what's called the Department of Education. However, after you graduate, the Department of Education basically takes your loans and they give it to what's called a student loan servicer, and they're going to collect the debt from you. So, for example, mine is called Great Lakes. Jared's is called Navient. So after you graduate, you're going to start getting emails and letters from whoever your student loan servicer is. Don't ignore those letters, okay? Because they're going to say it's time to repay your loans. Now, if you don't, if you don't choose anything different, they're going to put you on what's called a standard 10-year repayment. So they'll just take and they'll add up all the loans that you borrowed, all the percentages of interest, and they'll divide it out over a 10-year period, add all the interest on top, and they're going to say, this is what you owe us each month. You're going to pay this amount each month for 10 years, and then you will have paid us back. Now, some of you, a good choice to make is going to be paying off these loans as quickly as possible by making extra payments up front. So rather than riding it out over the 10-year period, if you can get rid of them quicker, you'll pay less interest in the long run. This is a very good choice. If you choose to do travel therapy, this is an even greater choice because you will have more money early in your career to throw at these loans and get rid of them as quickly as possible. Now, some of you may also look into what's called refinancing versus consolidating your loans. Consolidating your loans is an easy thing to do. It's still through the Department of Education. They just lump all your loans together into one big loan with an average rate rather than having all these little loans. This is fine, and this just makes it easier to manage. Now, if you decide to refinance, refinancing occurs through a third party. So this is a third party that's going to say, okay, I'm going to pay off your loans to the government, and then you just pay me back, and we negotiate a lower rate. This is great because sometimes you can get a lower rate. But what is very important to understand is if you decide to go this route, if you refinance with a third party, you give up any protections and rights that you had through the Department of Education. For example, if you come into hard times and you needed to go into forbearance, or you ever decided to switch to do an income-driven repayment forgiveness program, you will no longer be eligible for any of these government programs if you refinance through a third party. So it's just very important that you look into all the options, and if you decide to go that route, make sure that's what you want to do and you plan to pay them off as quickly as possible by refinancing. Now, another option, instead of the standard 10-year repayment, you could choose what's called an income-driven repayment option, which is either a 20 or 25-year period where they base your payment every month based on your income. So they'll look at your salary and they'll say, okay, you just need to pay us this amount, which is usually going to be a smaller amount, and you'll pay it over a 20 to 25-year period, and at the end, whatever's left over will be forgiven. However, what is forgiven, you would have to pay taxes on at that point. Now, this is all very complicated. There's also something called the public service loan forgiveness, and this is where if you work for a nonprofit organization for 10 years, you have to work consistently 10 years for a nonprofit organization, and they would forgive your loans at the end of that. It's another type of income-driven repayment. But again, I encourage you to visit studentloans.gov to look at all your options, probably close to graduation or right after graduation. Visit this website, read through all the options, run the scenarios, determine what's the best choice for you. Jared has written extensive articles about what we've chosen to do with our student loans, as well as some recommendations, and just trying to understand all these different options and weigh your options. You can visit our website at fifthwheelpt.com under finance, and you can read Jared's articles on that information there.
Yeah, and those articles lay out why we chose to do what we did and maybe some of the considerations you might consider to determine what's best for you. So definitely good articles to check out. So this is looking at an example of a traveler versus a permanent therapist that might choose to pay off their loans as quickly as possible, putting all of their extra money, all of that cash flow towards their student loans. This is using a lot of the same numbers we used before, slightly different. We're assuming a $70,000 salary, looking at what that would be after taxes, versus a travel therapist that is working 48 weeks per year, making $1,650 a week. Still, these are pretty average, realistic numbers that we've seen. And we're also assuming that the traveler has additional expenses, probably about $3,000 a month in expenses, whereas the permanent PT might have $2,600 a month in expenses. When you consider those numbers, you end up with a cash flow for each of them of about $3,600 per month that they can each put towards loans, $3,600 a month that the traveler can put towards loans, whereas the permanent PT has about $1,750 that they could put towards loans. That difference is only, it's about double, basically, that the travel PT is able to put towards their loans. And this example, what it's showing is how much those extra payments impact the interest that you pay over time. It's very important to realize that the longer you spread out paying back those loans, the more interest you're paying on them. So in this example, the travel PT putting that $3,600 towards their $120,000 in debt, which is also a pretty average number that we see for new grad PTs, they can pay that back in about 36 months, and they only pay a total of about $9,000 in interest over that time period. Whereas a permanent PT paying $1,750 a month, it would take them 81 months, so it's well over twice as long, and they also would pay about $21,000 in interest over that time period. So it's not a huge difference in the amount of time. It's a little over double, but the difference in interest is huge. It's $12,000 in difference there. So just that amount of time extra, a few more years of paying your loans, leads to a lot more interest paid over the long term. So that's important to realize.
A lot of these slides coming up are a little bit heavy on numbers, so we encourage you to spend some time with these slides, look at them more closely so you can better understand the figures that we're putting here. But basically, as you can see, by putting so much more money towards your loans as a travel therapist, you can pay them off not only a lot quicker, but in the life of the loan, you're going to pay less overall. And
this is what a lot of therapists do, a lot of travel therapists do, and this is what we thought we would do until I spent more time on the numbers and decided not to. But this would be a similar situation to the majority of travel therapists, I would say, putting as much as possible towards loans, getting it paid off in 2 or 3 years.
So here we want to talk a little bit about the concept of compounding interest. So compounding interest can apply to these debts that we're talking about, but can also apply to investments. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can invest early in your career to set yourself up for a good financial future. So the definition of compound interest is interest that is calculated on the initial principal, which also includes all of the accumulated interest of the previous periods of the investment or loan. Compound interest can be thought of simply as interest on interest. It will make a sum grow at a faster rate than simple interest, which is calculated basically on the principal amount. So what this is saying is it doesn't just grow at a linear fashion when you invest in the stock market, or, for example, the vice versa would be if you're having a debt that is accruing interest.
Especially something like credit card debt with a high interest rate that accumulates over time.
Yeah, so basically you're going to get interest on top of interest on top of interest. And we thought this is kind of a cool quote. Albert Einstein said, "Compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it."
And what's very interesting about compound interest is that it seems fairly straightforward. When you think about, okay, I have interest that accumulates, that increases the principal, which then has additional interest and accumulate on top of that. It seems pretty straightforward. But what's really difficult to wrap your mind around is how that changes over a long period of time. And that's what one of these examples coming up, we're going to look at how powerful that becomes over a 30-year period.
So we're basically going to make a case here for why it's important that you invest early in your career, because a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, my main focus needs to just be my loans beginning of my career. And we agree, trying to manage your debt is a very important thing, but we highly encourage you to start putting even a small amount into investment accounts, whether that's a 401k, a 403b, an IRA, some type of investment account early in your career, because early in your career, a dollar put in your 20s or 30s is going to grow exponentially, as Jared's going to lay out in this example, and make a huge difference. So immediately, whether you choose travel therapy or whatever your first job is, go to your HR department, sign up for whatever employer-sponsored investment account, and start contributing year one. Don't wait.
Yeah, a lot of people are intimidated coming out of school, or they want to just put it off. They don't want to put the time into learning about it. And that really is a mistake because, as we'll see in this example, compound interest is very powerful. It leads to a huge difference over time, and investing early really is so much more important than investing late. So let's look at this example. This is a permanent therapist again and a travel therapist. Very similar to that last example, but instead they're putting that extra cash flow that we talked about towards investing instead of paying off their student debt. And we're going to look at what happens to that amount over a long time period. So in this example, we have a travel therapist that works for 3 years as a traveler versus a permanent therapist that works for 3 years as a permanent therapist. After that 3-year period, the travel therapist settles down and then takes a permanent job making the same as the permanent therapist initially. So the permanent therapist, throughout an entire 30-year time frame, they invest $10,000 a year. The travel therapist starts out investing a much higher amount, the extra $21,600 that we talked about in the previous example. They start investing that early in their career for that first 3 years, and then they start investing only the $10,000 like the permanent therapist after they settle down. So in total, that only is a difference of about $65,000 only that they put into these retirement accounts or any kind of investment account for the travel therapist. But what we're going to see is how compound interest works and what that $65,000 turns into after a 30-year period. And this is based on an 8% market return, which is fairly common. That's close to the historic average of the stock market. So now, after 30 years, we can see here that $65,000 difference over that first 3 years, only $21,600 additional invested for the first 3 years, that turns into a $600,000 difference over a 30-year period with that money invested. The travel therapist in this situation would end up with $1.8 million after 30 years, assuming they continue to invest $10,000 every year after that first 3. And whereas the permanent therapist would end up with $1.2 million, and they invested that $10,000 every year from the very beginning. So $65,000 is a lot of money, but $600,000 that turns into from taking that money and investing it early is huge. And that is the difference between a very comfortable living situation, retirement, versus one that might be a little bit less comfortable. So investing early in your career is very, very important.
Yeah, and I think another important fact here is just look at the numbers. So even if you choose to not do travel therapy and you choose to go a permanent route, and maybe you have $10,000 extra in income you could put into an investment account for the first 30 years of your career or throughout your career, you can still come out a millionaire at the end. Look, Steve, in this example, who is a permanent therapist, he put $10,000 in an account every year for 30 years, and he came out over $1.2 million. So it's still a huge difference. Yes, it will make even more of a difference if you choose travel therapy and you have extra income to put in your first few years. But even if you just start contributing year one, regardless of your career path, you're really going to come out ahead.
And if any of this students that might be watching this, if this seems unrealistic, like $31,000 invested for the first 3 years for a travel therapist, from our own example, we invested for our first 3 years over double that amount. So it's not at all unrealistic. I think my first year I invested almost $70,000. So if you're taking high-paying contracts and you're keeping your living expenses low, you can really save a ton of money. Obviously, we were really hustling. I was very focused on this. It's not the norm, but that 31,000 number is definitely, I would say, on the low end of what you can really do if you focus on it.
So we're going to kind of wrap up here, do some conclusions just to sort of tie everything in together from the travel therapy perspective as well as the financial perspective. So in conclusion, travel therapy can be a great option for some new grads who want to experience new adventures and increase their financial potential. It's been an amazing choice for us. We would not be anywhere near the lifestyle and the life that we're living now if it weren't for choosing travel therapy, and we wouldn't change it for a second. It's definitely not for everybody. As we talked about in some of those beginning slides, it's very important if you're a new grad therapist, if you determine if it's going to be the right choice for you or not. You have to look inside yourself, look at your abilities and your confidence level and how comfortable you feel moving around and decide if it's right for you. And even if it's not right for you the very first year out of grad school, maybe you decide to take a permanent job for a little while, get some experience, and then go back to travel therapy. That's also a great option if it's something you want to pursue. Travel therapy can not only be an amazing experience, it can also provide an opportunity for increased income. As we've shown you in many examples, there's a lot of ways that you can increase your financial potential by being a travel therapist. This more money is going to allow you to have more opportunities and more options, whether it's to pay off your student loans, pay off other debts that you might have, or start investing early in your career, or some combination thereof. It can also set you up for a good financial future in terms of family planning, home buying, and those sorts of things. There are also several personal finance strategies that you can employ to set yourself up for success, whether you choose travel therapy or not. We highly encourage you to optimize your income and your expenses, which can add up to a major difference in your net worth over time. And the statement here, it's difficult to overstate the impact that compounding interest can have, and getting a head start on your finances early in your career will likely be one of the best decisions that you ever make.
Yeah, and a couple things to add in conclusion here. If there's one thing that you take away from this, whether or not you choose to travel or not, increasing your income as much as possible, looking at all the various options to do that, decreasing your expenses, increasing your income as much as possible, decreasing your expenses as much as possible to get as much cash flow as possible, and then allocating that in an intelligent manner, either towards debt or assets, is the most important thing that you can focus on probably as a new grad, besides your clinical skills and things like that. But getting that in order and setting yourself up for the future is going to be very important. Another thing I would say is, if anyone watching this maybe is on the fence about travel therapy, I would say it's worth giving it a shot, especially early in your career, because I cannot tell you how many permanent therapists we've talked to that took a permanent job out of school and they say, I really wish I'd done what you guys did. I really wish I'd tried that. And the reason for that is you can always settle down. There's never going to be a situation where you can't take a permanent job. But there are going to be situations in your life when you have a family that you might not be able to travel anymore. So for people that, obviously this doesn't apply to every PT student, but for people that are not tied down to any one location, they don't have a family yet, it's the perfect time in your life to go out and explore, see new places, and basically figure out what you want to do with life. And you probably won't regret it. There are situations where people have bad experiences, but for the most part, I think most people have a good experience and they really enjoy the flexibility and the extra pay.
Yeah, and like we said, even if you decide travel therapy is not right for you, just getting ahead on your finances, whatever career path you choose, you're not going to regret it, because we just want to encourage you to, take this income that you're suddenly going to have and do good with it. You don't live paycheck to paycheck. Don't get yourself in debt. Don't, have to work until you're 70 years old if you don't want to. I mean, if you love physical therapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy and you want to work forever, do it. But don't be tied down to a job just because you can't afford not to be. So we highly encourage you just to take, grains of what we've talked about today and apply it to your life, however it can benefit you. Here's some contact information if you guys would like to get in touch with us for more information about what we've talked about today. If you'd like mentorship in regards to getting started with a travel therapy career, please feel free to reach out to us. You can find us on social media, on Facebook and on Instagram. On Instagram is where I share a lot of our travel photos. So our upcoming trip to Latin America, you'll see a lot of our photos from throughout the country and internationally. You can follow us at Travel Therapy Mentor on Instagram. On our website, traveltherapymentor.com, is where we write a lot of articles about the various ins and outs of travel therapy, so you can find information there. On our Facebook page, facebook.com/traveltherapymentor, you'll find our weekly videos. Every week we do a video about various travel therapy topics to educate and mentor other people who are current therapists or thinking about doing travel therapy in the future. And then on fifthwheelpt.com is where we talk more about just finances and our own travel journeys and that kind of thing. So please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you get started in your travel therapy career or answer any questions that you have.
Yep. Thanks for watching, and definitely feel free to reach out. We're always willing to help in any way that we can. Good luck with whatever you decide to do, and make the best of your financial situation.
Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Yep.